Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, desperate for the bathroom, stumbling through the familiar darkness of your own home, reaching for the bathroom door handle that you've touched 1,000 times before, and opening it to find yourself standing in a stranger's living room with a family you've never met, staring at you from their couch as if you're the one who doesn't belong. Now imagine that same family greeting you by name, asking why you're up so late, treating you like you've lived with them your entire life. This is exactly what happened to Kevin Martinez, and it was only the beginning of discovering that the doors in his apartment weren't portals to the rooms he expected, but gateways to completely different realities where alternative versions of his life were unfolding simultaneously. Kevin had lived in his small 2-bedroom apartment for 3 years without any unusual occurrences. The bathroom door led to the bathroom, the kitchen door led to the kitchen, and his bedroom door led to his bedroom. This basic geography of his living space was as reliable as gravity, as dependable as the sunrise, until one Tuesday night when everything he thought he understood about the boundaries between rooms, between spaces, between entire realities, shattered completely. It was 2:47 a.m. when Kevin woke with the urgent need to use the bathroom. He'd made this journey countless times before, could navigate it in complete darkness, knew exactly how many steps from his bedroom to the bathroom door, exactly how the handle felt under his hand, exactly what sound the hinges made when the door swung open. But when Kevin opened the bathroom door that night, he found himself staring not at white tiles and a porcelain toilet, but at a carpeted hallway decorated with family photos he'd never seen before, leading to a living room where soft light from a television illuminated 3 people sitting on a couch. Kevin's first thought was that he was still asleep, experiencing some kind of vivid dream brought on by the spicy food he'd eaten for dinner. But everything felt absolutely real. The texture of the carpet under his bare feet, the cool air from what must have been air conditioning, the distinct smell of popcorn mixed with something floral like an air freshener or scented candles. This wasn't the fuzzy, unstable reality of dreams. This was as solid and present as anything Kevin had ever experienced. The 3 people on the couch turned to look at him, and what happened next was somehow more unsettling than finding himself in the wrong place. They smiled, not with surprise or alarm or confusion, but with the casual recognition of people greeting someone familiar. A woman in her 40s stood up from the couch and said, "Kevin, honey, couldn't sleep? There's leftover pizza in the fridge if you're hungry." She spoke with the comfortable intimacy of someone who'd known him for years, someone who had the right to call him honey and offer him leftover pizza. Kevin stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what was happening. He wasn't in his bathroom. He was in someone's home, someone who apparently knew him, who lived with him, who expected to see him wandering their hallway at 3 in the morning. He opened his mouth to explain that there must be some mistake, that he didn't know these people, that he was supposed to be in his bathroom, but the words caught in his throat when he saw the photos on the wall. They were pictures of him, or someone who looked exactly like him. Kevin standing with his family at what looked like a beach vacation. Kevin wearing a graduation cap and gown, standing between the woman who just offered him pizza and a man who Kevin now realized must be her husband. Kevin as a child, gap-toothed and smiling, holding what looked like a Little League trophy. These weren't photos of a stranger who resembled him. These were photos of him, in a life he'd never lived, with a family he'd never met. The teenage boy on the couch called out, "Hey Kevin, you gonna watch the rest of the movie with us or just stand there being weird?" The casual annoyance in his voice suggested this was normal sibling behavior, that Kevin being weird was a regular occurrence, that they had the kind of relationship where teenage brothers rolled their eyes at each other over unfinished movies. Kevin finally found his voice stammering something about being confused about needing to go back. But when he turned to retreat through the doorway he'd entered, he found himself looking at a closed bathroom door with a small decorative sign that read, "Wash your hands." This wasn't his apartment anymore. He was fully in this other space, this other home, with no obvious way back to where he belonged. The woman stood up and walked toward him with genuine concern, replacing her earlier casual greeting. "Kevin, are you okay? You look pale. Did you have another one of those nightmares?" She reached out to touch his forehead, checking for fever with the automatic gesture of someone who'd done this many times before, someone with the earned intimacy of a mother checking on her son. Kevin pulled back instinctively, his mind reeling with implications he couldn't quite grasp. Another one of those nightmares. The phrase suggested this version of Kevin, the one who lived here, had a history of nighttime disturbances. It suggested a shared past that Kevin had no memory of, conversations and experiences that had never happened from his perspective, but were absolute reality from theirs. He mumbled something about needing air and backed away from the woman's concerned reach, moving down the hallway toward what he hoped might be an exit. Every step took him deeper into this impossible space, past more photos documenting a life that wasn't his but somehow was, past a bedroom with another version of his name on the door, past evidence of an entire existence he'd never lived. But that felt authentic in ways that made his actual life feel questionable. Kevin found a door that looked like it might lead outside and grabbed the handle with desperate hope. But when he opened it, he found himself back in his own apartment, standing in his bedroom doorway, staring at his unmade bed exactly as he'd left it. The transition was instant and complete, with no hallway or intermediate space between the stranger's home and his own. He was simply back, as if he'd never left, except for the racing of his heart and the cold sweat covering his skin. For several minutes, Kevin stood motionless, trying to convince himself it had been a dream, some kind of sleepwalking episode where he'd hallucinated an entire alternate reality. But the details were too specific, too consistent, too real. He could still smell the popcorn, could still feel the texture of that carpet under his feet, could still hear the teenage boy's annoyed voice asking if he was going to watch the rest of the movie. Kevin didn't attempt to use the bathroom again that night. He stayed in his bedroom until morning, door closed, lights on, afraid of what might happen if he opened any door in his apartment. When dawn finally broke and sunlight filled his room with reassuring normalcy, Kevin cautiously opened his bedroom door, half expecting to find himself in some other impossible location. The door led exactly where it was supposed to lead, his living room, unchanged and completely normal. Kevin spent the next hour opening and closing every door in his apartment, checking and rechecking that they all led to their proper destinations. Bathroom door led to bathroom, kitchen door led to kitchen, front door led to the hallway outside his apartment. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it had been for 3 years. Kevin almost managed to convince himself that the previous night's experience had been a bizarre dream, a one-time glitch in his sleep-deprived brain. Then he opened the kitchen door to make breakfast, and found himself standing in the middle of a bustling office surrounded by cubicles and people in business attire. This transition was somehow more disorienting than the bathroom incident because Kevin was fully awake, alert, and certain of what should have been on the other side of that door. He'd been reaching for the coffee maker, planning his breakfast routine, expecting his small kitchen with its outdated appliances and collection of takeout menus stuck to the refrigerator. Instead, he was standing in fluorescent lighting, breathing recycled office air, listening to the ambient sounds of typing keyboards and muted conversations. The reaction from the office workers was the same as the family from the night before. They looked at him with casual recognition rather than surprise. A woman at a nearby desk called out, "Kevin, finally! The Peterson account spreadsheets are on your desk. We need them reviewed before the 11 o'clock meeting." She spoke with the expectation of someone assigning work to a coworker, someone who had every right to expect Kevin to know what the Peterson account was and why those spreadsheets mattered. Another voice came from across the room. "Hey, Martinez, you coming to happy hour after work? Jessica's leaving for her new job. Figured we should send her off properly." The familiar use of his last name, the casual invitation to happy hour, the assumption that he knew who Jessica was and why her departure mattered, all suggested a depth of workplace relationships that Kevin had never developed because he'd never worked in this office, had never met. These people had never heard of the Peterson account or Jessica's new job. Kevin looked around desperately for the door he'd entered through and found what appeared to be a break room entrance. He ran toward it, ignoring the confused looks from coworkers who apparently expected him to be reviewing spreadsheets rather than fleeing the office. When he pulled the door open, he was back in his kitchen, standing in front of his refrigerator, heart pounding, hands shaking. This time there was no possibility of dismissing the experience as a dream. Kevin had been fully awake, fully conscious, and fully aware that opening his kitchen door should not and could not transport him to an office building that might not even exist in his version of reality. Whatever was happening with his apartment doors was real, was happening while he was awake, and was completely outside his ability to understand or control. Over the next week, Kevin documented every door transition with obsessive detail. He discovered that the destinations weren't consistent or predictable. The bathroom door sometimes led to the bathroom, sometimes led to the family home where people called him honey and offered him leftover pizza, and occasionally led to completely new locations he'd never seen before. The kitchen door alternated between his actual kitchen and the office where people expected him to review the Peterson account spreadsheets. His bedroom door proved to be the most unpredictable and disturbing. Sometimes it led to his bedroom, sometimes to a spacious master bedroom in what appeared to be a much larger house, and once to a forest clearing where a German shepherd ran up to him with joyful recognition, tail wagging, expecting the version of Kevin who apparently owned dogs and spent time in forests to greet him properly. The people Kevin encountered in these alternate spaces all treated him with the same casual familiarity, as if he belonged in their reality as much as he belonged in his own. They referenced shared experiences he had no memory of, reminded him about commitments he'd never made, asked about projects he'd never started. In the family home, they asked about his classes at community college. In the office, they discussed his progress on various client accounts. In the forest, the dog brought him a stick to throw, having apparently played this game countless times before. What disturbed Kevin most was the accumulation of evidence that these weren't random alternate realities but specific alternative versions of his own life. In the family home, he found yearbooks with his photo, report cards with his name, trophies with his achievements in sports he'd never played. In the office, his desk contained personal photos, coffee mugs with inside jokes he didn't understand, and a nameplate that read Kevin Martinez, Senior Account Manager. In the house with the master bedroom, he found a wedding photo on the dresser showing him married to a woman he'd never met, both of them smiling with the comfortable happiness of people who'd built a life together. These weren't just other places. These were other versions of his life, alternative paths his existence might have taken if he'd made different choices, if circumstances had aligned differently, if the countless decision points that shape a life had tilted in different directions. Through his apartment doors, Kevin was accessing parallel realities where he'd stayed close to a family he'd actually drifted from, where he'd pursued a corporate career instead of freelance work, where he'd found love and marriage instead of remaining single. Sarah Chen experienced something similar in her downtown loft, though her dimensional door transitions followed different patterns. For Sarah, it was her apartment's front door that became unstable, leading sometimes to the building's hallway as it should, but increasingly often to the entrance of completely different residences. She'd leave for work in the morning and find herself stepping into a suburban house with toys scattered across the floor and children calling her mom. The children in that reality knew her intimately, ran to her with the casual affection of kids greeting their mother, asked her to help with homework and settle sibling disputes. They called her mommy and expected her to know where the snacks were kept and whether they could have friends over after school. Sarah, who had no children in her reality, found herself temporarily responsible for kids who depended on her, who loved her, who needed her in ways that made her actual childless life feel incomplete. Marcus Rivera's dimension doors revealed something even more unsettling, the possibility of accessing not just alternative present realities, but different time periods. The closet door in his bedroom sometimes opened to show clothes hanging exactly as he'd left them, but increasingly often revealed a smaller closet with clothing styles from what appeared to be the 1990s. When Marcus stepped through, he found himself in a younger version of his body, living in his childhood home, with parents who weren't yet aware of the health problems that would affect them in the coming decades. In this past reality, Marcus retained his current memories and awareness, but existed in a body and circumstances from 25 years earlier. His parents treated him like the teenager he appeared to be, referencing events from that era, having no awareness of the adult man who'd stepped through a dimensional door from the future. Marcus found himself living dual existences, his actual adult life in the present, and intermittent returns to his teenage years whenever his closet door decided to access that particular timeline. The implications of Marcus's experience suggested that dimension doors might not just connect parallel present realities, but could bridge different time periods, allowing people to literally revisit their pasts or perhaps access their futures. If doors could lead to different versions of the present and different points in personal history, what other temporal and dimensional combinations might be possible? The psychological toll of living with dimension doors was significant. Kevin never knew whether opening a door would take him where he expected or drop him into an alternative version of his life where people had expectations he couldn't meet and relationships he'd never developed. Every simple action like using the bathroom or getting something from the kitchen became fraught with potential for displacement into realities where he didn't fully belong. The people Kevin encountered in these alternate realities began noticing inconsistencies in his behavior. The family that called him honey started commenting that he seemed distant and confused. The office coworkers noticed he couldn't find his desk without guidance and had no memory of projects he'd supposedly been working on for months. The German shepherd in the forest seemed confused when Kevin didn't know the commands and games they'd apparently played together countless times. For everyone experiencing dimension doors, the question became not just why this was happening, but which reality was truly theirs. If Kevin existed as a family member in one reality, a corporate employee in another, and a dog owner in a third, which version was the real Kevin? Or were they all equally real, equally valid versions of the same person living simultaneously across multiple dimensions, with unstable doors occasionally allowing their consciousnesses to slip between these parallel existences? The dimension doors had revealed that the boundaries between spaces weren't as solid as anyone had believed, that rooms might be less about physical architecture and more about dimensional coordinates, and that the simple act of opening a door could transport consciousness between realities where different versions of the same life were unfolding in parallel. The most terrifying aspect wasn't the displacement itself, but the growing uncertainty about which reality was home, which life was real, which version of Kevin Martinez was the authentic one, or whether that question even had a meaningful answer anymore. Kevin Martinez's discovery that his apartment doors could transport him between parallel realities was just the beginning. Within months of his first displacement, reports began flooding online forums from people across the globe experiencing identical phenomena. Doors in homes, offices, cars, even public buildings were becoming unstable, leading not to the expected rooms and spaces, but to entirely different realities where alternative versions of people's lives were unfolding simultaneously. What had seemed like an isolated impossibility was revealing itself to be a widespread breakdown in the boundaries that separated parallel dimensions. The true scope of the dimension door phenomenon became clear when Kevin connected with others through an online support group. Jennifer Walsh described opening her car door in a shopping mall parking lot and stepping out not into the parking lot, but into her own driveway, at a house she'd never owned where a husband she'd never married was asking what had taken her so long at the grocery store. She'd spent 20 confused minutes in that reality, trying to understand who this man was and why he seemed to know her so intimately, before retreating back into her car and finding herself returned to the mall parking lot. David Chen's experience was even more disturbing because it involved his children. The door to his daughter's bedroom sometimes opened to show her sleeping peacefully in her familiar pink-painted room, but increasingly often revealed a completely different child's room decorated in blues and greens, with a boy's toys scattered across the floor and sports posters on the walls. In this alternate reality, David had a son instead of a daughter. A child who called him Dad with the same love and trust, but who existed in a timeline where different circumstances had led to a different family structure. Most heartbreaking was David's realization that both realities felt equally real, equally valid. His daughter Amy was absolutely his child, the light of his life, the center of his existence. But when the bedroom door transported him to the reality where he had a son named Michael, that child felt equally real, equally important, equally deserving of a father's love. David found himself torn between two realities, two children, two versions of fatherhood that couldn't coexist but seemed equally authentic. The dimension doors didn't just connect people to random alternate realities. They seemed to specifically access parallel versions of their own lives, realities where different choices had led to different outcomes. Sarah Martinez discovered this when her bathroom door began leading to a luxury penthouse apartment instead of her modest bathroom. In this alternate reality, Sarah had apparently made different career choices that led to extraordinary financial success. The penthouse was filled with expensive furniture, designer clothing, and evidence of a life lived at the highest socioeconomic levels. But this alternate successful Sarah paid a price for her wealth. The penthouse felt empty, despite its luxury, with no photos suggesting close relationships, no evidence of the family and friend connections that enriched Sarah's actual life. When Sarah encountered her alternate self's calendar and saw nothing but work meetings and business dinners with no personal commitments, she realized this parallel reality represented a path where professional success had come at the cost of personal connection. The ability to access these alternate life paths forced people to confront roads not taken, to witness the consequences of choices they'd made or avoided. Marcus Thompson opened his front door one morning and found himself in a reality where he'd never recovered from the addiction that had nearly destroyed his life years ago. This alternate Marcus lived in squalor, estranged from family, trapped in cycles of self-destruction that the real Marcus had fought desperately to escape. The experience was traumatic but also oddly validating. Marcus could see the direct consequences of the choice he'd made to seek help, to commit to recovery, to rebuild his life one difficult day at a time. The dimension door had shown him not just an alternate reality, but a warning of what his life would have become if he'd made different choices at a crucial moment. Some people discovered that their dimension doors led to futures rather than alternate presents. Amanda Foster's bedroom door sometimes opened to show not her familiar bedroom, but a nursery decorated for a baby, in an apartment she didn't recognize, but that felt like home. In this future reality, Amanda had apparently become a mother, with baby supplies and parenting books, suggesting a life stage she hadn't reached yet but might be approaching. The future nursery appeared with increasing frequency, and Amanda noticed the baby's room evolving over multiple visits, showing different stages of decoration and preparation, as if time in that reality was progressing normally, even when Amanda wasn't present. She began to recognize the nursery as a possible future version of her own life, a path she was moving toward, a reality that might become her present if current trends continued and certain choices were made. The most unsettling aspect of dimension doors was the discovery that people's alternate selves in other realities were aware of the displacements. Kevin returned to the family home reality multiple times and found that the family had noticed his confusion and inconsistency. They'd begun questioning why he sometimes acted like he'd never met them, why he couldn't remember shared experiences, why he seemed disoriented by a home where he supposedly lived. During one visit, the woman who called him honey sat him down for a serious conversation about his behavior. She expressed concern about his memory lapses, his confusion about family routines, his apparent inability to remember events they'd all participated in together. She suggested seeing a doctor, getting his memory checked, addressing what she perceived as a serious cognitive problem. Kevin couldn't explain that he wasn't her son, that he came from a different reality, that his confusion stemmed from being a visitor to a life he'd never actually lived. The explanation would sound insane, would mark him as delusional rather than displaced. So Kevin simply nodded and agreed to whatever she suggested, playing along with expectations he couldn't meet while feeling increasingly guilty about deceiving people who genuinely cared about a version of him that might be real in their reality but wasn't him. The corporate office reality, where Kevin had a senior account manager position, became even more complicated when he discovered that his alternate self had been developing work products that were now past deadline. Coworkers were frustrated by Kevin's missed deadlines, confused by his inability to remember project details, concerned about his job performance. Without meaning to, Kevin was damaging the professional reputation of an alternate version of himself who'd worked hard to build a career in that reality. The German Shepherd in the forest reality began showing signs of confusion and distress when Kevin visited. The dog would initially greet him with joyful recognition, then gradually become uncertain and whimper, as if sensing that this wasn't quite the Kevin he knew. Animals apparently could detect the displacement in ways humans couldn't, could sense that the person opening the door wasn't the same consciousness that usually inhabited that body in that reality. Attempts to control or predict the dimension doors proved frustrating and largely unsuccessful. Kevin tried developing rituals around door opening, approaching from different angles, opening with specific hand positions, trying to mentally focus on desired destinations. Nothing worked consistently. The doors led where they led, following patterns that might exist but were too complex or random for humans to discern or manipulate. Some dimension door travelers discovered that prolonged stays in alternate realities could have lasting effects. Maria Santos spent several hours in a reality where she had a successful art career, painting in a studio that was far superior to anything she'd been able to afford in her actual life. When she returned to her own reality, she retained muscle memory and technical knowledge from her alternate self, finding that her painting skills had mysteriously improved even though she hadn't actually practiced. This suggested that experiences in alternate realities could transfer learning, skills, and knowledge between versions of the same person. If consciousness could access multiple realities through dimension doors, perhaps the brain could integrate experiences from all these parallel existences, allowing people to benefit from lives they'd lived in other dimensions. But this knowledge transfer also had disturbing implications. Robert Kim returned from an alternate reality where he'd been involved in a violent confrontation, carrying emotional trauma from an experience that had happened to an alternate version of himself. The fear, the adrenaline response, the psychological impact of violence were all real, even though Robert himself had never been in that situation in his own timeline. The dimension doors were creating psychological cross-contamination between parallel lives, mixing experiences and emotions across realities in ways that made it increasingly difficult for people to maintain stable identities. If Robert carried trauma from an alternate self's experiences, was that trauma real? Did he deserve treatment for events that happened to someone who was him, but also wasn't him? Relationships became extraordinarily complicated when dimension doors affected multiple people simultaneously. The Henderson family discovered that their home's doors were accessing multiple alternate realities, where their family structure was completely different. In one reality, the parents had divorced and their teenage daughter lived primarily with her mother. In another, they'd never had children and remained a childless couple focused on careers. In yet another, they had 3 children instead of 1, with a bustling household completely unlike their actual family configuration. When family members accidentally accessed different alternate realities simultaneously, they would return with conflicting memories and experiences. The daughter might visit a reality where she had siblings while her parents accessed a timeline where they were childless, creating confusing disconnects where each family member had temporarily lived in incompatible versions of their family's story. Some dimension door travelers discovered that they preferred their alternate realities to their actual lives. Jessica Martinez found that in one of her parallel existences, she'd maintained a relationship with her estranged father, enjoying a close father-daughter bond that had never developed in her primary reality. She began spending more time in that alternate world, deliberately opening the doors that led to a reality where her father loved her, and she felt valued in ways her actual life had never provided. But prolonged stays in alternate realities created problems. Jessica began missing work in her primary reality, neglecting relationships and responsibilities because she was spending days or weeks at a time living her alternate father-daughter relationship. Friends and family in her original timeline noticed her absences and growing detachment, unaware that she was literally living in another dimension where her emotional needs were better met. The question of where people truly belonged became increasingly complex. If Jessica felt more authentic, more loved, more complete in her alternate reality, did she have an obligation to remain in her original timeline? If someone discovered a parallel existence where they'd made better choices, built better relationships, and created a more fulfilling life, was it wrong to prefer that reality over the one they'd been randomly born into? Children experiencing dimension doors faced unique challenges because they often couldn't distinguish between their multiple realities. 8-year-old Tommy Chen moved freely between a reality where his parents were married and another where they'd divorced, adjusting his behavior based on which family structure he encountered, but gradually losing track of which reality was his original home. His parents in both timelines noticed his confusion, but attributed it to the stress of what they perceived as their own pending divorce, rather than understanding that Tommy was literally experiencing multiple versions of his family simultaneously. Elderly people with dimension doors faced different problems because their alternate realities often included versions of themselves at different ages. Eleanor Walsh, 78 years old, sometimes opened doors to find herself in a 50-year-old body, living in a timeline where decades of her life hadn't occurred yet. Conversely, her doors sometimes led to futures where she was much older or had already died, revealing fates that might await her in different versions of her timeline's progression. Government agencies became aware of the dimension door phenomenon when enough cases accumulated to form undeniable patterns, but their response was limited by the unpredictable nature of the displacements. How do you investigate or regulate doorways that lead to different realities sporadically and without any known method of control? How do you verify someone has claimed that their bathroom leads to an alternate dimension when the door might work normally whenever officials try to document it? The existence of dimension doors raised profound philosophical questions about identity and reality. If Kevin Martinez existed simultaneously as a family member in one reality, a corporate employee in another, a dog owner in a third, and a freelancer in a fourth, which version was the real Kevin? Or were they all equally real, all equally valid expressions of the same consciousness experiencing different paths through the infinite possibilities of existence? The most disturbing discovery came from temporal physicists studying the phenomenon. The dimension doors weren't anomalies or glitches, but might represent the actual underlying structure of reality. According to their theory, every decision point in existence creates branching timelines where different choices play out, and dimension doors were simply locations where the barriers between these constantly multiplying realities had become thin enough for consciousness to slip through. If this theory was correct, then everyone existed in infinite versions simultaneously, living every possible variation of their life across countless parallel realities. The dimension doors weren't creating these alternate existences, but merely revealing them, showing people the truth that consciousness wasn't confined to a single timeline, but existed simultaneously across all possible versions of reality. For those experiencing dimension doors, this meant that the life they considered real was just one path among infinite possibilities, with no inherent superiority or authenticity. Every choice they made created new branches, new realities, new versions of themselves living the consequences of different decisions. The doors allowed glimpses into this vast multiplicity, showing people the lives they might have lived, were living, and would live across the infinite spectrum of existence. The psychological impact of understanding one's existence as simultaneously occurring across infinite realities was profound. People struggled with decision paralysis, knowing that every choice created new branches, new versions of themselves who would live the consequences of paths not taken. Relationships became complicated by the knowledge that in some reality, every possible outcome was occurring. Couples who stayed together in one timeline were divorcing in another. Children who thrived in one reality were struggling in others. The dimension doors had revealed that reality itself was far more complex and unstable than anyone had imagined, that the boundaries between possible worlds were permeable enough for consciousness to slip through, and that every person existed in countless versions simultaneously, living every variation of their life across infinite parallel dimensions. The simple act of opening a door had become a gateway to understanding the fundamental multiplicity of existence, where the question wasn't which reality was real, but whether the distinction between real and alternate had any meaning in a universe where all possibilities existed simultaneously.